On December 7, 1941, roughly 10 miles from Oahu's shores in Hawaiian waters, Lieutenant Mochitsura Hashimoto occupied his position as torpedo officer aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-24. Through the dim pre-dawn light, he observed as the vessel detached its midget submarine, sending it racing toward Pearl Harbor for the assault that would change everything. As the morning progressed and flames erupted across Battleship Row, dark smoke began consuming the Hawaiian sky. Throughout the Pacific, Japanese officers greeted what appeared to be an overwhelming triumph against the industrial powerhouse they'd been cautioned could never truly be overcome. Surrounding Hashimoto, his fellow officers radiated certainty that American naval strength had been fatally crippled, that Japan's technological edge would secure lasting supremacy. Yet what remained hidden from their understanding was that those burning harbors contained the genesis of Japan's eventual ruin. The instruments of their destruction were already being loaded into American submarines, weapons so flawed that Japanese intelligence dismissed them as proof of American technical incompetence. The arithmetic of Japan's naval collapse would not be determined by the spectacular carrier engagements that would dominate history books, but rather by the relentless mechanical failures of American torpedoes that would paradoxically fuel the most destructive submarine campaign ever waged at sea. The foundation of this mutual misreading and technological scorn had been laid long before the first bombs struck. The seeds of arrogance were sown on May 13, 1940, when an anonymous source, whose identity remains protected to this day, delivered the United States naval attaché in Tokyo with extensive technical intelligence regarding the Type 93 oxygen torpedo. This weapon, which the Allies would eventually call the Long Lance, embodied the zenith of Japanese naval craftsmanship, a technological accomplishment that should have alarmed American naval leadership. The specifications were remarkable, almost implausible to Western eyes. Operating at ranges surpassing 22,000 yards when traveling at 48 knots and stretching to 33,000 yards at reduced speeds, carrying a warhead containing 1,800 pounds of high explosive, it represented the most sophisticated torpedo in existence by a substantial margin. The informant supplied technical blueprints, performance specifications, and tactical guidelines describing exactly how Japanese destroyers and cruisers would deploy this weapon during night surface engagements. The Office of Naval Intelligence thoroughly examined this intelligence, relayed it to the Bureau of Ordnance for technical review, and received a judgment that would prove disastrously mistaken. The Bureau simply rejected the report outright. Their logic was straightforward and reflected the prejudices pervading Western military thinking about Asian technological capabilities. Japanese engineers, they reasoned, lacked the capacity to produce a torpedo exceeding American designs. Employing pure oxygen as a propellant, while theoretically feasible, appeared too hazardous and too demanding for an Asian power to manage effectively. The intelligence disappeared into files and faded from memory. During the subsequent months, as Japanese hostility intensified, this analytical failure would claim thousands of Allied servicemen and numerous vessels. This dismissal mirrored a more extensive disdain that permeated Western military institutions regarding Japanese technical prowess as war approached. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, destined to command Pacific amphibious operations and earn 4 Navy Crosses, had addressed Congress in 1940, arguing that Japanese aviators suffered from supposed biological deficiencies affecting their vision and spatial orientation. These racist assertions, dressed as scientific analysis, maintained that Japanese pilots possessed inadequate night sight for combat effectiveness, that their technical preparation lagged behind Western standards, that their aircraft represented imitations of Western designs lacking superior engineering or metallurgy. Army Air Corps intelligence evaluations during 1941 confidently declared the Zero fighter derived from obsolete American designs and would prove inferior against American warplanes in actual combat. Such miscalculations would exact a price in American lives during the war's opening phase, when Japanese aviators commanding technically superior fighters and executing refined tactical methods achieved air dominance above the Philippines, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies. The consequences of this intelligence breakdown manifested almost immediately following Pearl Harbor. 7 American cruisers met their destruction from Type 93 torpedoes throughout the Pacific conflict. The heavy cruisers, Quincy, Vincennes, Astoria, Chicago, and Northampton, succumbed to long lances discharged from distances the Allies deemed impossible. 9 destroyers similarly went down to these weapons. The fleet carrier Hornet, already damaged by dive bombers at Santa Cruz, received its final blow from destroyer-launched Type 93 torpedoes. Beyond 3,100 American sailors perished as a direct consequence of long lance strikes. Typically, ships believed themselves safely distant from torpedo threat when the weapons struck home. Watchmen scanning the sea detected no enemy craft within striking distance. Commanding officers steering their vessels believed they operated safely beyond reach, relying on intelligence assessments of Japanese torpedo range capabilities. Yet long lances launched from cruisers and destroyers 15 or 20 miles away would pierce through the darkness and detonate with overwhelming destructive power. The initial significant engagement occurred at the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27, 1942. Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman, leading a hastily assembled force comprising American, British, Dutch, and Australian cruisers and destroyers, steered his ships from Surabaya to intercept a Japanese invasion armada approaching Java. His combined force included the heavy cruisers Exeter and Houston, the light cruisers De Ruyter, Java, and Perth, plus 9 destroyers representing 4 distinct navies with 4 different tactical approaches and serious communication difficulties. Doorman represented a capable commander placed in an untenable situation, directing vessels unfamiliar with coordinated operations, commanding crews exhausted from months of continuous withdrawal, confronting a Japanese force that had trained together extensively and functioned under unified command and tactical doctrine. Engagement commenced at 1600 hours when Japanese and Allied forces achieved visual contact. Operating from ranges invisible to most Allied vessels, the Japanese heavy cruisers Haguro and Nachi, accompanied by the light cruiser Naka and destroyer support, adjusted their formations to bring torpedo armaments into range. At 1633 hours, the light cruiser Naka discharged 4 Type 93 torpedoes from 15,000 yards. Her accompanying destroyers responded, releasing 27 additional torpedoes between 1640 and 1645 hours, all fired from 13,000 to 15,000 yards distant. At 1652 hours, the heavy cruiser Haguro contributed 8 more torpedoes from the astounding distance of 22,000 yards, over 11 nautical miles. The expanse between opposing forces transformed into a passage crowded with roughly 40 long lances traveling at shallow 12-foot depths, leaving no observable tracks, their oxygen engines producing 0 telltale disturbances. Allied spotters and sonar personnel, schooled to detect torpedoes at far shorter distances, consistent with American and British weapon capabilities, observed nothing until catastrophe arrived. At 1713 hours, a single Type 93 struck the Dutch destroyer Kortenaer amidships. The half-ton warhead erupted against the destroyer's vulnerable hull plating, the detonation splitting her keel. Kortenaer convulsed and disappeared beneath the waves in under 2 minutes, dragging the majority of her 150-strong crew to their deaths. Allied leadership, unable to reconcile torpedo attacks from such tremendous distances, concluded that submarines must have been responsible. Throughout the subsequent battle hours, Allied warships executed sharp evasive maneuvers to escape what they believed were submarine-launched weapons, fragmenting their tactical formation and preventing organized offensive action against the Japanese surface element. Conflict persisted for 7 hours while Doorman pushed repeatedly toward the transport vessels and Japanese forces blocked his passage. The heavy cruiser Exeter absorbed an 8-inch shell penetrating her boiler compartment, impairing her velocity and forcing her from the battle line. The British destroyer Electra perished from artillery fire, pursuing a gallant though unsuccessful torpedo run. Doorman's diminished force, reduced to 4 cruisers after American destroyers withdrew due to fuel and ammunition depletion, sustained pursuit of the invasion convoy through the darkness. At 23:25 hours, Japanese cruisers Haguro and Nachi, monitoring the Allied group by radar, dispatched another torpedo salvo from distance. At 23:32 hours, One Type 93 penetrated the light cruiser Java, her magazines igniting explosively. Java disintegrated and vanished almost instantaneously, taking 512 of her crew of 600 downward with her. Moments afterward, at 2338 hours, a second Long Lance found Dorman's command vessel, De Ruyter. The torpedo detonated within the cruiser's ammunition storage, triggering a massive secondary detonation. De Ruyter fractured longitudinally and disappeared within moments, claiming Rear Admiral Dorman and 345 of his sailors. The Battle of the Java Sea cost the Allies 2 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, and approximately 2,300 deceased sailors. Japanese losses consisted of 4 transports struck by surface-launched Japanese torpedoes and modest destruction to a single destroyer. Java fell to invasion forces with 0 additional resistance. Perhaps more importantly, the engagement illustrated the Type 93 torpedo's devastating capability and the Allies' complete inability to counter it. Yet American intelligence, reviewing battle documentation and debriefing survivors, rebuffed acceptance that surface warships had launched torpedoes from the reported distances. Intelligence remained that submarines carried responsibility, that Japanese surface-deployed torpedo performance matched Allied capability, that accounts of extreme-range torpedo strikes represented exaggeration by traumatized crews experiencing intense combat pressure. This tendency persisted through the Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, among the most catastrophic American Navy setbacks. At 01:43 hours, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft released illumination flares suspended by parachute above the Allied cruiser formation guarding Guadalcanal operations, rendering the American and Australian vessels visible against the nocturnal background. Minutes elapsed before Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's armada, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, plus 1 destroyer, achieved torpedo launching proximity. The engagement consumed 32 minutes. Upon conclusion, the Australian heavy cruiser Canberra was going down, having absorbed 2 Type 93 torpedo strikes and 24 8-inch shell impacts. The American heavy cruisers Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria blazed fiercely and would perish before sunrise. The heavy cruiser Chicago escaped with her bow portion, destroyed by a torpedo hit. Approximately 1,000 Allied sailors perished that evening, suffocating below as their vessels burned and descended, or dying instantaneously when torpedo detonations fractured their ships. American survivors documented torpedoes originating from improbable distances and directions, munitions displaying no observable wakes, explosions suggesting Japanese torpedoes possessed directional control and maneuvering capability after launching. Intelligence analysts characterized these testimonies as battle-induced confusion, the predictable inclination of survivors to magnify dangers and justify failure. Assessments persisted that Japanese torpedoes performed comparably to American weapons, possibly superior in selected respects, yet not fundamentally different. This purposeful rejection of available evidence would endure until 1943, when recovered intact Type 93 torpedoes from destroyed Japanese warships finally validated the pre-war intelligence. By that moment, thousands of Allied personnel had fallen and numerous vessels had been destroyed by a weapon American intelligence maintained couldn't possibly exist. This deliberate disregard for Japanese technical achievement paralleled Japanese dismissal of American weapons capabilities, establishing a reciprocal intelligence catastrophe that would yield profoundly different outcomes for each combatant. When American submarine squadrons commenced operational patrols in December 1941, Japanese naval intelligence compiled analyses of early American torpedo engagements, treating them with unconcealed satisfaction and growing assurance that submarine threats posed manageable difficulties. Documentation described failure after failure, malfunctions appearing so systematic they pointed toward inherent American torpedo defects and insufficient American submarine crew preparation. On December 14, 1941, merely 1 week following Pearl Harbor, the submarine Seawolf under Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder encountered a Japanese cargo vessel moored off southern Mindanao's coast in Philippine waters. Warder positioned his craft into perfect launching geometry, measuring 3,000 yards to target, the vessel stationary and unprotected. He released 8 Mark 14 torpedoes, The American submarine fleet's standard armament, each costing approximately $10,000 and representing considerable production resources. 7 torpedoes passed harmlessly, either submerging beneath the target or straying from course. The 8th impacted the freighter directly at the waterline. Seawolf's personnel detected the distinctive metallic percussion of impact traveling through the submarine's hull. Silence followed. The torpedo, its warhead containing 643 pounds of explosive compound, had struck squarely yet detonated nothing. The freighter's crew, perceiving the submarine's position, initiated immediate departure and escaped while Seawolf descended to evade the anticipated depth charge assault that never materialized, because the Japanese vessel possessed no submarine detection equipment. On December 24, 1941, on Christmas Eve, the submarine Sargo, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Tyrell Jacobs, discovered 4 Japanese merchant vessels transiting off southern China's coast, proceeding in loose formation without defensive escort. Jacobs maneuvered his boat into textbook assault arrangements, discharging 3 torpedoes at each of 4 targets, 12 total from distances spanning 1,000 to 2,000 yards. Circumstances aligned perfectly. Waters remained calm, visibility unsurpassed, targets maintained consistent headings and velocities. Every torpedo either deviated completely or malfunctioned, producing not a solitary detonation. Jacobs monitored his periscope as torpedo after torpedo disappeared beneath targets, or struck then remained inert or detonated prematurely with insignificant effect. He released a final attack, his remaining 4 forward tube weapons, against a substantial cargo vessel that had halted and begun launching small boats to investigate the circumstances. All 4 torpedoes passed underneath the stationary craft. Sargo arrived at Manila Bay on December 30th, her complement discouraged, having expended all 24 onboard torpedoes without destroying one vessel. Commander Jacobs submitted a forceful after-action report stating explicitly that his torpedoes descended substantially beyond their assigned depth settings, proceeding safely beneath targets. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, overseeing torpedo advancement and manufacturing, disregarded his grievances with unconcealed dismissiveness. The responsibility, Bureau authorities asserted, originated with submarine commanders lacking knowledge of proper torpedo servicing, with crews executing improper pre-launch processes, with captains executing inadequate attack approaches. The Bureau maintained that the Mark 14 represented the most advanced, most comprehensively analyzed weapon available to American forces, and that any problems reflected operational incompetence rather than inherent defects. This assertion survived with bureaucratic persistence for approaching 2 years, while American submarines discharged multitudes of faulty torpedoes and Japanese merchant vessels progressed safely, carrying unexploded American torpedoes lodged within their structures. Japanese intelligence personnel, observing American submarine transmissions, breaking partial American communication codes, and questioning captured submarine crews, collected extensive intelligence on American torpedo malfunctions. This intelligence reached Imperial Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo by early 1942, subsequently evaluated by military intelligence personnel who reached precisely incorrect conclusions. American weaponry, they reported, represented primitive systems burdened by critical manufacturing flaws. American submarine forces demonstrated inadequate preparation and lacked the combat aggression essential for successful operations. The presumably formidable American manufacturing apparatus generated weapons performing defectively, vessels technologically inferior to Japanese designs, apparatus deteriorating under combat circumstances. This judgment, grounded in legitimate observation of American technical failures, yet profoundly misconstrued in meaning and implication, would emerge as one of the most damaging intelligence miscalculations in contemporary warfare. The year 1942 saw this troubling cycle repeat itself with relentless sameness throughout the Pacific theater. American submarines would position themselves carefully, fire their torpedoes with confidence, and then watch in frustration as nothing happened. The numbers painted a stark picture of what was actually occurring. During 1942 alone, American submarine forces in the Pacific expended 1,442 torpedoes against Japanese vessels. According to official reports at the time, these attacks resulted in the sinking of 201 ships, with a combined tonnage reaching nearly 1.3 million tons. Yet when the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee later examined Japanese records after the war ended, the reality proved shockingly different. Only 109 ships had actually been sunk, representing a mere 41,871 tons of shipping destroyed. This meant the claimed tonnage was wildly inflated, barely 3% of what had been reported. Submarine commanders grew increasingly bewildered as they returned to base with report after furious report. Their torpedoes were running far too deep before detonating. Others were exploding prematurely, their warheads igniting long before reaching intended targets. Still others struck ships directly and simply failed to go off at all. Japanese merchant captains began sharing stories of American torpedoes that had lodged inside their hulls, unexploded and inert. These damaged vessels would limp back to port, where Japanese ordnance specialists could carefully extract the weapons, examine them with professional detachment, and actually grow more confident that the American submarine threat could be managed. This growing sense of security among Japanese leadership shaped critical strategic decisions. If American submarines weren't truly dangerous, then convoy escorts could be reduced. The merchant fleet could operate with minimal protection. Resources could flow through the supply lines that kept Japan's war machine running. That confidence influenced how Japan allocated its industrial capacity and shipbuilding priorities. It determined the nature of their anti-submarine warfare doctrine. Resources that might otherwise have gone toward constructing protective escort vessels, developing effective detection systems, and training crews in anti-submarine tactics were instead diverted elsewhere. Those resources flowed instead into battleships and large fleet carriers, the type of vessels that Japanese naval doctrine insisted would decide the war in one decisive engagement. This fundamental misunderstanding would persist well into 1943. By the time Japan finally recognized the genuine scale of the submarine threat, it was already far too late to build the convoy protection systems and defensive measures that might have saved the merchant marine. The actual situation was vastly more complicated than anyone realized, and ultimately far more devastating for Japan than military intelligence assessments had suggested. The source of this catastrophe traced back to the Mark 14 torpedo itself. Designed during the Great Depression when testing budgets had been slashed to almost nothing, the weapon suffered from 3 severe defects that compounded each other and made identifying them extraordinarily difficult. To understand how these problems were eventually identified and corrected requires looking back at how the torpedo was conceived, tested, and put into service. Work on the Mark 14 began in 1931 with the objective of replacing the Mark 10, an aging design left over from the First World War that equipped older S-class submarines. The new torpedo was destined for the fleet submarines then being constructed, vessels like Gato, Wahoo, and Tang that would form the backbone of America's submarine force. The design specifications were remarkably ambitious. The finished weapon would stretch 20 feet 6 inches long, weigh 3,000 pounds, carry a warhead containing 643 pounds of Torpex explosive, and be capable of traveling either 4,500 yards at 46 knots or 9,000 yards at the slower speed of 31.5 knots. The design incorporated a sophisticated gyroscope guidance system that would maintain course with precision. A hydrostatic mechanism would regulate the depth at which the torpedo ran. Most ambitiously, the weapon would carry the Mark 6 exploder, a magnetic influence device representing the cutting edge of weapons technology. This magnetic system would detect the presence of a ship's steel hull passing overhead and detonate the torpedo beneath the target, where the explosion would prove most catastrophic for the vessel above. The Mark 6 represented a genuine technological leap. Rather than requiring a direct collision with a target's hull, this magnetic system would sense the disruption of Earth's magnetic field caused by the passage of a large steel ship. When those magnetic disturbances reached a particular threshold, the exploder would activate, firing the warhead far below, where the destructive force would be maximized. German submarines had experimented with magnetic explosions during the First World War with mixed success. British torpedoes used similar systems with moderate effectiveness. The American Mark VI was engineered to be more sensitive, more reliable, and more sophisticated than anything previously attempted. The problem lay entirely in how it was tested. A single Mark XIV torpedo carried a price tag exceeding $10,000, equivalent to roughly $200,000 in modern money. During the depths of the Great Depression, with Congress scrutinizing every naval expenditure and military budgets cut to bare minimums, the Navy leadership simply refused to spend money destroying expensive torpedoes through live-fire testing. Instead, the Mark XIV underwent evaluation using exercise heads, dummy warheads designed for recovery and reuse after test firings. These exercise heads were filled with water and air in proportions that approximated the weight of an actual combat warhead. Torpedoes carrying these practice heads would be fired at targets or through carefully measured ranges to verify that depth control systems functioned properly and that the gyroscope guidance operated as designed. After each firing, the torpedoes would be recovered, inspected, and then reused on the next test. This approach seemed both sensible and economical. It proved tragically inadequate. While the exercise head approximated the overall weight of the combat warhead, its weight distribution was fundamentally different. An actual combat warhead packed 643 pounds of high explosive concentrated in the forward section of the torpedo. The exercise head distributed water throughout the warhead section. This difference in how the weight was positioned changed the torpedo's trim characteristics and altered its hydrodynamic behavior in ways that only became visible once the weapon entered combat service. Additionally, no live fire testing was ever conducted against actual target ships to verify that the magnetic exploder would function properly under real combat conditions. The Mark VI magnetic system was classified so secret that submarine commanders were forbidden from examining it or even understanding its basic operation. The entire system received approval for combat use based solely on mathematical calculations, laboratory tests, and exercise firings that never replicated what actually happened in combat. The first problem involved depth control. Mark XIV torpedoes consistently ran 10 to 11 feet deeper than their set depth because the depth control mechanism had never been properly tested using the heavier combat warhead. Engineers had increased the warhead weight during final development, adding 80 additional pounds of explosive to boost destructive power, but they failed to recalibrate the hydrostatic depth sensor accordingly. Moreover, this sensor was positioned poorly on the torpedo's body, in a location where water flow created pressure variations that confused the mechanism. As a torpedo accelerated to combat speed, water flowing across the hull created a pressure drop at the sensor location, the same phenomenon that generates lift on aircraft wings. The depth mechanism interpreted this pressure drop as an indication that the torpedo was running too shallow and responded by adjusting the torpedo's trim to run deeper. The faster the weapon traveled, the stronger this effect became. Every Mark XIV fired in combat during 1941 and 1942 ran significantly deeper than intended. Torpedoes programmed to maintain a 10-foot depth, designed to strike ships at the waterline, instead ran at depths of 20 to 25 feet, passing harmlessly underneath their targets. A simple test conducted in a laboratory, merely submerging a stationary torpedo in still water, would never have revealed this problem because there was no water flow to create the pressure effect. Dynamic tests using exercise heads with depth recording instruments showed the torpedo maintaining its set depth, yet the depth measuring device in the exercise head had the same positioning flaw and produced consistently inaccurate readings. The defect was genuine. It affected every single torpedo that was fired, and yet the testing protocols used were fundamentally incapable of detecting it. This single flaw would have created serious problems by itself, but its effects were disguised by the second defect, the magnetic exploder. The Mark VI was designed to fire when it detected the magnetic signature generated by a ship's steel hull passing overhead. Theoretically, this was elegant. The torpedo would run beneath the target and explode directly underneath, where the shockwave and gas bubble would prove most effective at breaking the vessel's back. In practice, the Mark VI proved devastatingly unreliable. Earth's magnetic field varies considerably depending on location, influenced by latitude, local geology, and numerous other factors. The Mark VI had been tested near Newport, Rhode Island, where the naval torpedo station was located. The magnetic field strength and orientation in that region suited the exploder's operation perfectly. In combat zones across the Pacific, near Java, the Philippines, Guadalcanal, and Japan itself, magnetic field characteristics were fundamentally different. The Mark VI, calibrated for Newport conditions, malfunctioned catastrophically in actual combat environments. Some torpedoes exploded prematurely, detonating 50 or 100 yards before reaching their targets after detecting the target's magnetic signature from too great a distance. These premature detonations caused minimal damage. They merely alerted targets that an attack was underway and gave them time to take evasive action. Other torpedoes passed completely beneath their targets and failed to detonate at all because the magnetic field changes in the actual operating environment weren't sufficient to trigger the exploder. Submarine commanders peering through periscopes watched in mounting frustration as perfectly executed attacks resulted in premature explosions that inflicted no damage whatsoever. They filed report after detailed report documenting these failures and recommending that the magnetic feature be disabled entirely. The Bureau of Ordnance responded by insisting that the problem stemmed from inadequate maintenance, improper calibration procedures, or crews failing to follow proper operating protocols. The deep-running defect and the magnetic exploder malfunction masked each other in ways that made diagnosis extraordinarily difficult. When torpedoes ran too deep, they never triggered the magnetic exploder because they passed far beneath the target's magnetic signature. Correcting the depth seemed like it would also fix the exploder problem. Yet when depth was finally corrected in mid-1942, the magnetic exploder continued malfunctioning, and then the contact exploder revealed its own catastrophic failure. The third defect resided in the contact exploder mechanism itself. The Mark VI incorporated both magnetic and contact firing systems within a single unit. Should the magnetic system fail to detonate the torpedo during its passage beneath the target, the contact exploder would theoretically activate when the torpedo struck the target's hull. The contact system employed a firing pin design that had functioned reliably in earlier torpedoes operating at lower speeds. The Mark X, which the Mark XIV replaced, achieved a maximum speed of 36 knots. The Mark VI's contact exploder had been designed and tested for that speed range. The Mark XIV operated at 46 knots, 28% faster, yet nobody had conducted testing to verify whether the contact exploder would perform properly at this higher impact velocity. When a torpedo traveling at 46 knots collides with a steel hull, the deceleration happens almost instantaneously and with extraordinary violence. The firing pin in the Mark VI's contact exploder was relatively heavy, held in place by a spring that needed to be stiff enough to prevent accidental firing during routine handling and transport, yet flexible enough to allow the pin to move when the torpedo struck a target. At the Mark XIV's high impact velocity, particularly during the 90-degree angle hits that submarine crews had been trained to execute, the violent deceleration caused the firing pin to jam in its housing before it could strike the detonator cap. The friction forces acting on the pin during deceleration exceeded the spring force meant to drive it forward. The result was that textbook perfect shots, direct 90-degree angle impacts, exactly as taught in submarine school, were the most likely to be complete duds. Only oblique angle hits, where deceleration occurred more gradually, allowed the firing pin to function properly. This particular defect had actually been identified and corrected in older torpedo models back in 1922. The solution involved using a stiffer spring and lighter firing pin components. Yet when the Mark VI was designed and engineered to incorporate the new magnetic exploder function, the lessons from that earlier fix were apparently lost or overlooked. The contact exploder simply retained the old firing pin mechanism without any testing to confirm it would work at the Mark XIV's higher operational speed. Japanese merchant vessels started arriving back in port bearing evidence of American torpedo strikes. Sometimes these ships actually carried unexploded American torpedoes embedded in their hulls. For American submarine crews who had executed textbook perfect attacks, these scenes represented the ultimate humiliation. The human cost during 1942 and into early 1943 proved staggering. Submarine commanders would stalk targets for hours or even days, carefully maneuvering into perfect attack positions while constantly risking detection by Japanese anti-submarine forces. They would fire volleys of torpedoes that should have guaranteed successful kills, then watch in anguish as the attacks failed or as premature detonations simply warned targets without sinking them. The psychological toll on submarine crews became severe. Men who had spent years training to become submarine warriors, who deliberately took their boats into extreme danger, despite understanding that submarines suffered the highest casualty rates of any American combat branch, who risked their lives executing what should have been perfect attacks, watched helplessly as those attacks failed due to fundamental defects in their primary weapon. The impact on morale was devastating. Commander Frederick Warder, commanding the submarine Seawolf, located an 8,000-ton Japanese transport ship anchored in Talamo Bay in the Philippines during January 1942. The circumstances were ideal. The target sat motionless, completely unescorted, and positioned perfectly for attack. Warder fired 4 Mark 14 torpedoes from virtually point-blank range. He heard 4 distinct metallic clangs as they struck the transport's hull. Not a single warhead detonated. The transport crew, now alert to Seawolf's presence, but still undamaged, got the vessel underway and began maneuvering in evasive patterns while radioing for air support. Warder ordered his tubes reloaded, this time with older Mark 10 torpedoes, antiquated World War I-era weapons lacking the Mark 14's sophisticated systems, but reliable. The first Mark 10 exploded against the transport's stern section with authority. Warder fired again, and this torpedo struck amidships with force, breaking the ship's back. The transport went down within minutes. Warder's after-action report stated plainly that the Mark 14 was defective and should be removed from service immediately. The Bureau of Ordnance not only disregarded his recommendation, but responded by suggesting that Warder needed better training in proper torpedo maintenance procedures. Commander Eugene McKinney aboard the submarine Tambor fired 8 Mark 14 torpedoes at a Japanese destroyer in April 1942 from a distance of 800 yards. He distinctly heard 8 metallic clangs as each one struck the destroyer's thin hull plating. None of them exploded. The destroyer, now fully aware of Tambor's location and bearing, launched a counterattack with depth charges that detonated close enough to shatter light bulbs throughout the submarine and rupture hull seams in multiple compartments. Tambor fought her way through the darkness and violent seas, finally breaking the surface to breathe and begin her emergency repairs. McKinney's crew located 8 of their precious torpedoes bobbing in the water around them. They hauled the weapons aboard and examined the warheads with meticulous care, finding no signs of detonation. The disturbing findings went straight back to Pearl Harbor in an urgent radio transmission, with McKinney spelling out in brutal detail exactly what had gone wrong and what he'd witnessed. The Bureau of Ordnance fired back with accusations. They blamed McKinney for sloppy handling and neglectful upkeep, insisting that careless maintenance practices had caused the firing mechanisms to fail. But the Japanese were listening. Their cryptographers were working overtime decoding American submarine radio traffic, and their agents posted in American ports were sending back consistent reports. The word spreading through Japanese military circles was clear and damning. American submarine commanders themselves were claiming their weapons didn't work. Japanese strategists saw this as proof positive of technological weakness and inferior American training. The Japanese approach to stopping submarines never truly matured because their own intelligence agencies kept insisting the threat wasn't serious enough to worry about. Their defensive efforts remained locked on shielding battle fleets and task forces rather than protecting the merchant vessels carrying the nation's lifeblood. Destroyers and patrol boats designed primarily for surface engagement lacked sophisticated sonar systems, adequate stockpiles of depth charges, and the tactical knowledge to hunt submarines effectively. Japanese shipbuilding focused almost entirely on battleships and fleet carriers destined for one massive decisive battle, while humble cargo escorts received little attention or resources. Everything changed dramatically during 2 separate attacks in June and July 1943 that finally forced the Bureau of Ordnance to confront the hard truth they'd been denying. On June 10th, Commander Roy Benson brought his submarine trigger into contact with Heiho, one of Japan's most prized aircraft carriers and absolutely vital to Japanese naval aviation. Benson positioned trigger with textbook precision, moving into the perfect firing stance at barely 1,200 yards away, a range where failure seemed almost impossible. Benson released 6 torpedoes in a carefully orchestrated pattern, spacing them to guarantee multiple strikes no matter how the carrier twisted and turned to escape. But Heiho reacted with a sharp emergency maneuver. 2 of the torpedoes missed completely. Another detonated 70 yards short of the hull, and through trigger's periscope, Benson watched the underwater explosion light up the darkness without inflicting any real damage. Then came the hammer blow. 1 torpedo slammed directly into Heiho's hull and simply failed to detonate. Only 2 of the 6 torpedoes actually worked, punching through the carrier's armor belt and exploding inside. The damage was serious enough to slow Heiho down and ignite fires, but not serious enough to send her to the bottom. Destroyer escorts surrounding the damaged carrier immediately launched a ferocious depth charge barrage at trigger's estimated position. Heiho managed to limp away towards Sasebo for urgent repairs instead of sinking into the depths. The repair yards got Heiho back into working condition inside 6 weeks. She would live to fight again at the Philippine Sea in June 1944, her aircraft striking American carriers before another submarine finally put her down for good. That single failure on June 10th, with 2 of 6 torpedoes refusing to function as designed, robbed the United States of a carrier at a moment when every flat top mattered desperately in the Pacific balance of power. Had Heiho gone down in June 1943 instead of surviving to June 1944, her absence might have prevented her aircraft from conducting combat missions that killed American sailors and pilots. The consequences of these torpedo failures rippled through the entire war effort. But the second incident would prove far more compelling in forcing genuine action. On July 24th, Lawrence Daspit, commanding the submarine Tinosa, spotted a massive whale factory ship, the Tonan Maru, steaming solo and unprotected south of Truk with no escorts in sight. Here was a submariner's dream target. The vessel loomed enormous on the horizon, moved slowly through the water, had no weapons, and brimmed with whale oil destined for Japanese factories. That whale oil went into explosives manufacturing, food production, and industrial lubricants. Sinking this single ship would deliver both immediate destruction and longer-term damage to Japanese industry. Daspit guided Tinosa into attack position at 4,000 yards and released 4 torpedoes. Through the periscope, he watched 2 connect with the target. The whale factory ship shuddered and ground to a halt in the water, completely immobilized. Daspit immediately fired 2 more torpedoes in quick succession. Both found their mark. 4 hits should have been more than enough to send any merchant vessel straight to the ocean floor. The Tonan Maru remained afloat, dead in the water, silent, but stubbornly refusing to sink. With no Japanese anti-submarine forces visible anywhere on the horizon, Daspit possessed a rare luxury: time. He maneuvered Tinosa with surgical precision into a position barely 875 yards directly off the target's beam, positioned where any shot was virtually impossible to miss, and every torpedo would strike at the perfect 90-degree angle for maximum damage. Daspit ordered 9 more torpedoes fired. Through his periscope, he tracked each one as it streaked toward the stationary target, each impact carefully observed despite machine gun fire chattering from the whale ship's deck. All 9 torpedoes struck the unmoving vessel squarely and cleanly. Not a single one detonated. Daspit heard the dull, hollow thuds reverberating through Tinosa's steel hull as each torpedo impacted the target. Not one explosion, not a glimmer of fire. Daspit suspected his submarine had received defective weapons from the torpedo factory. He left his final torpedo unfired to carry back to Pearl Harbor for expert analysis, then withdrew before Japanese aircraft could arrive to hunt him. He had expended 15 torpedoes at a target that couldn't move, under absolutely perfect attack conditions, where half of them achieved direct hits at the ideal angle. 15 hits total. 15 failures total. None had exploded early, none had run wild. Every single one had worked perfectly, except for detonating. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding the Pacific submarine fleet since January 1943, recognized that Daspit's patrol report represented a controlled experiment conducted under actual combat circumstances. Lockwood himself carried experience from commanding submarines in the 1920s and 1930s before advancing to senior leadership positions. For 2 years, he had listened to submarine captains describe torpedo failures. He watched the Bureau of Ordnance reject every complaint, blaming operator mistakes, poor maintenance habits, or faulty attack procedures. He witnessed the devastating impact on submarine crews who executed flawless attacks only to watch their weapons fail them. He reviewed intelligence reports suggesting Japanese merchant ships were arriving at port harboring unexploded American torpedoes in their hulls. Now here was Daspit's patrol report, complete with photographs and meticulous observations, proving that the contact exploder was fundamentally broken. Lockwood demanded immediate testing. His team established a test facility where dummy warheads could be dropped from a crane onto steel plates angled to simulate the various impacts a torpedo might experience. The tests exposed a chilling truth. The firing pin mechanism jammed up and seized when impacts occurred at high velocities, particularly when the impact angle was perfectly perpendicular to the target. The heavier the firing pin and the more sudden the deceleration, the worse the jamming became. Those picture-perfect 90-degree hits that submarine commanders spent their careers learning to execute, those ideal shots that generated the most violent deceleration, made the firing pin mechanism absolutely unable to move fast enough to strike the detonator. The contact exploder was defective by design, and that defect got worse the better the submarine commander's shooting was. The answer came from an unexpected direction. When Japanese aircraft came down during the Pearl Harbor attack, American gunners had brought several to Earth. Naval Air Station engineers studying the wreckage discovered that Japanese propellers were constructed from light aluminum alloy instead of the heavy steel Americans favored. The material possessed sufficient strength for its job, but weighed dramatically less. This observation sparked an idea about the firing pin problem. If engineers replaced the steel firing pin with lightweight aluminum, the reduced inertia during deceleration would prevent binding. The theory tested out perfectly. By September 1943, 21 months after Pearl Harbor, modified torpedoes with aluminum firing pins and additional design refinements began arriving at Pearl Harbor and Fremantle for distribution to waiting submarines. The explosion in American submarine capability that followed September 1943 remains one of the most transformative shifts in naval warfare history. Throughout the period from December 1941 through August 1943, American submarines had operated with their primary weapon functioning only marginally at best. 3 distinct catastrophic design flaws, each masking the presence of the others, had rendered the Mark 14 essentially broken. Submarine commanders had compensated through improvisation and adaptability, setting torpedoes to run shallow to work around depth control deficiencies, deliberately disabling the magnetic exploder to prevent premature detonations despite orders to the contrary, attempting oblique angle approaches rather than the textbook 90-degree angles they'd been trained to execute. These were nothing more than temporary solutions, stopgap measures that addressed symptoms instead of solving the disease underneath. But once September 1943 arrived and all 3 defects were corrected, the Mark 14 finally became the weapon designers had intended. Depth performance functioned reliably. The magnetic exploder vanished entirely, replaced by contact detonation alone. The contact detonator now performed reliably, regardless of impact angle or velocity. Submarine commanders who had earned their expertise through 2 years of harsh battlefield lessons, who had endured combat with defective weapons and emerged alive, now possessed torpedoes that actually functioned. The effect on Japanese merchant traffic was immediate and overwhelming. Japanese naval planners observing the early submarine campaign through 1942 and into early 1943 had reached comforting conclusions. The submarine threat was manageable and controllable. Escort resources got devoted primarily to defending battle fleets and troop convoys rather than merchant protection. Destroyer escorts and patrol boats concentrated on defending battleships and carriers. Anti-submarine doctrine prioritized protecting military objectives and high-value targets. The merchant fleet, hauling raw materials from conquered territories across Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies back to Japan, then transporting finished weapons and equipment forward to combat zones, operated with skeleton crews and minimal protection, based on the assessment that American submarines lacked the capability to fundamentally disrupt Japanese logistics. That assessment proved catastrophically wrong once American torpedoes started working. The submarine flasher commanded by Reuben Whittaker intercepted a convoy off the China coast on December 22, 1944. Whittaker positioned his boat for attack and launched 6 torpedoes toward 3 tankers in the formation. All 6 functioned perfectly. 3 ships, the 10,000-ton Omarosan Maru, the 9,200-ton Arita Maru, and another 9,200-ton Otawasan Maru, all brimming with fuel oil from the Dutch East Indies heading toward Japan, disappeared beneath the waves in less than 20 minutes. A single well-executed attack had obliterated over 28,000 tons of shipping and sent hundreds of thousands of gallons of irreplaceable fuel down to the ocean bottom. The submarine Barb under Commander Eugene Fluckey produced even more remarkable achievements. During her 11th combat patrol in 1945, Barb sank 17 vessels totaling over 96,000 tons, establishing a tonnage record for a single patrol that would never get surpassed. Operating off the China coast on June 23, 1944, Fluckey brought Barb into a convoy attack inside Namquan Harbor. In 54 minutes of intense action, Barb sank 4 ships for over 15,000 tons. These weren't lucky breaks or random triumphs. These represented methodical attacks executed with working weapons by submarine commanders who had learned through hard experience how to employ them effectively. The statistics document the transformation unmistakably. In 1942, submarines fired 142 torpedoes and claimed 201 ships for 1.3 million tons, but actual confirmed results showed 149 ships for barely 41,171 tons. In 1943, as torpedo problems gradually got fixed, submarines fired 3,937 torpedoes and sank 284 ships for 1,349,473 tons. In 1944, with fully functional torpedoes operational, submarines fired 6,924 torpedoes and sank 492 ships for 2,388,000 tons. The capability leap was roughly tenfold once weapons started functioning properly. When the war ended, American submarines had dispatched 1,178 Japanese merchant vessels, amounting to 5,553,191 tons, representing 54.6% of all Japanese merchant losses from every source. More crucially, they had destroyed 201 Japanese naval vessels, including the massive aircraft carrier Shinano, the largest carrier ever constructed at 72,000 tons and the biggest warship ever sunk by submarine attack. The economic devastation proved catastrophic and fundamentally reshaped Pacific War strategy. Japan depended entirely on ocean commerce for survival. Raw materials from conquered regions across Southeast Asia, China, and the Dutch East Indies required shipment to Japanese factories for processing. Military production had to reach forward bases and frontline zones by sea. Food imports sustained the civilian population. Oil from the East Indies fueled every military operation and industrial process. By January 1945, the Japanese merchant marine had dwindled to barely 25% of its December 1941 capacity. Tanker convoys carrying oil from the East Indies were being sunk faster than they completed their voyages home. Cargo vessels loaded with raw materials were going down with full holds. Food shipments had shrunk to levels where rationing within Japan approached genuine starvation. Every consequence cascaded through Japan's entire military-industrial system. The oil refineries dotting Japan's home islands fell silent as crude supplies from the East Indies dried up completely. Japan's petroleum production had always struggled to meet military demands, even when imports flowed steadily from the Dutch East Indies and Borneo. Now those imports ceased entirely, and production collapsed to almost nothing. Steel mills ground to a halt, iron ore vanished, coking coal disappeared from the supply chain. Aircraft factories stopped their assembly lines with no aluminum coming in. Japan produced virtually no aluminum domestically, making every fighter and bomber dependent on foreign sources. Pilot training programs halted. Sailor training ceased. Fuel simply wasn't available. The mighty naval fleet that had once ruled the Western Pacific sat uselessly in port, vessels tied to docks or swinging on anchors with empty fuel tanks. The combined fleet, once standing as the world's third-largest navy and a force that had crushed the Russian Navy at Tsushima and controlled the Pacific in 1942, found itself paralyzed. Ships couldn't move, crews couldn't train. The arsenal of the empire had become a floating museum. Army divisions scattered across China, Southeast Asia, and Pacific Islands withered away from lack of supplies and reinforcements. Ammunition ran short. Replacement weapons never arrived. Medical supplies disappeared. Food became scarce. Everything had to come from Japan by ship, yet increasingly those vessels never reached their destinations. They went to the bottom of the ocean instead. Troops on remote garrisons endured months between supply shipments while submarines hunted down the freighters that kept them alive. Battle losses couldn't be replaced because troop transports carrying fresh soldiers were torpedoed and sunk before they arrived. The Japanese army, which had swept across vast territories conquering Chinese, British, Dutch, and American forces in the war's opening chapters, found itself slowly starving in fortified positions. The logistics network keeping it alive was being systematically destroyed by American submarines. The Japanese people faced potential starvation as food shipments stopped coming. Japan had never grown enough food to feed itself, relying on imports from Korea, Formosa, and Southeast Asia to keep its population nourished. By 1945, submarine attacks had reduced those imports to a trickle barely worth mentioning. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya saw their populations grow hungrier as rice rations were cut again and again. Black markets sprang up as desperate families paid outrageous prices for any food they could find. The government tried harsh measures to maintain order, but couldn't escape a simple truth. Japan couldn't feed itself without imports, and submarines had cut those imports to levels that couldn't sustain the nation. American strategic bombing campaigns, though they received enormous attention and dominated post-war histories, actually played a secondary role compared to the submarine blockade in crippling Japan's war effort. The Army-Air Force firebombing of Japanese cities devastated civilians and left deep psychological scars. Yet the immediate damage to Japan's war economy remained limited. Factories needed raw materials to operate. Without steel, aluminum, coal, and oil, they couldn't function whether bombs fell on them or not. The real strangulation came from the sea. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, gave the Japanese government a face-saving way to surrender. But Japan had already been defeated economically and militarily long before those weapons fell. The nation couldn't continue fighting regardless of what happened on battlefields, because submarines had destroyed the economic foundation of its entire war machine. One final irony deserves telling. The Type 93 long-lance torpedo had terrified Allied navies in 1942 and 1943. Japanese intelligence had pointed to it as proof of their technological superiority. By 1944, American forces had developed countermeasures and tactics that rendered it increasingly irrelevant. Radar warning systems gave American ships advance notice when Japanese surface forces approached, allowing them to maneuver and evade before torpedoes could even launch. Better damage control procedures helped American ships survive torpedo hits that would have sunk them earlier in the war. Tactical formations that limited exposure to torpedo attacks reduced the effectiveness of long-range salvos. Most crucially, American surface forces grew increasingly aggressive, supported by overwhelming air power that sank Japanese ships faster than Japan could build them. By 1944, American cruisers and destroyers engaged Japanese surface forces with growing confidence. Their technological advantages simply outweighed Japanese torpedo range. American ships possessed radar fire control systems that enabled accurate shooting through darkness and poor visibility. They maintained reliable radio communications that allowed coordinated fleet operations. They enjoyed numerical superiority in virtually every encounter. The weapon that should have given Japan a decisive advantage in surface combat became almost irrelevant as American submarines systematically destroyed the merchant vessels that powered the Japanese war machine. Japanese destroyers and cruisers, designed to unleash devastating torpedo attacks in nighttime surface engagements, found themselves relegated to escort duty, protecting whatever merchant shipping remained, a role they weren't suited for and one they performed poorly. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 showed how dramatically the balance of naval power had shifted. On June 19th, the submarine Kavala, commanded by Commander Herman Kosler, intercepted the Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku as her aircraft were recovering from strikes against American forces. Kosler fired 6 torpedoes from 1,100 yards out. 4 found their mark. The explosions ignited aviation gasoline reserves and triggered catastrophic secondary blasts. Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz, and the flagship of Japanese carrier operations in 1942, sank within minutes, taking 1,263 crew members with her. Hours later, the submarine Albuquerque, commanded by Commander James Blanchard, fired a single torpedo at the brand-new armored carrier Taiho, Japan's most advanced carrier and flagship of the mobile fleet. The torpedo struck forward. Japanese damage control officers, confident the heavily armored carrier could absorb one torpedo hit, made a catastrophic mistake. They attempted to vent gasoline fumes by running the ventilation system at maximum capacity. This spread explosive vapors throughout the vessel. 7 hours after the torpedo struck, at 15:32 hours, Taiho exploded in a tremendous detonation that blew open her sides and broke her keel. She sank quickly, taking 1,650 sailors with her, including Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's entire command staff. These weren't lucky accidents or fortunate shots. These were precisely executed attacks using weapons functioning exactly as designed against targets Japan simply couldn't afford to lose. Shokaku and Taiho represented 40% of Japan's remaining large carriers. Their destruction on a single day by American submarines crippled Japanese naval aviation at the exact moment when it faced the American fast carrier task force in the Philippine Sea. The battle, known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, annihilated Japanese carrier air groups so completely that Japanese carriers would never again pose a serious threat to American naval forces. American carrier pilots shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft in one day, while losing only 29 of their own. Submarines had struck first, eliminating 2 irreplaceable fleet carriers before American carrier aircraft even engaged the Japanese fleet. Japanese naval planners, still guided by intelligence assessments that had classified American submarines as a secondary threat, positioned their carriers in waters patrolled by American submarines without adequate anti-submarine protection. The result was catastrophic. Even if Japanese naval aviation could somehow train replacement pilots and rebuild air groups, insufficient carriers remained to carry them. Japanese naval aviation, which had dominated Pacific skies in 1942, ceased being an effective fighting force by mid-1944, and American submarines had dealt the critical blows that made that defeat inevitable. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated how completely the submarine campaign had shifted the technological balance. On October 23, as Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force approached the Philippines through Palawan Passage, threading through narrow waters en route to Leyte Gulf, American submarines intercepted the column. The submarines had been positioned along the expected transit route based on excellent intelligence from code-breaking operations, showing how thoroughly American forces integrated communications intelligence with tactical submarine warfare by 1944. At 0532 hours, DACE, commanded by Commander David McClintock, detected the Japanese column on radar at 30,000 yards. He maneuvered his submarine into attack position and tracked the force for 4 hours, while radioing contact reports that allowed Data, commanded by Commander Bladen Claggett, to position for a coordinated strike. At 0927 hours, DACE fired 6 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Otago, Admiral Kurita's flagship. 4 torpedoes struck home. The explosions tore enormous holes below the waterline. Otago lost electrical power instantly. Her engineering spaces flooded. She started sinking rapidly. Admiral Kurita and his staff abandoned ship, swimming through oil-covered water as destroyers raced to rescue them. Otago went down at 09:55 hours, just 28 minutes after the torpedo strikes, taking 360 of her 800-man crew. Dace immediately shifted targets, firing 4 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Takao. All 4 hit. The explosions broke her keel and flooded multiple compartments. Takao didn't sink immediately. Her crew managed to seal off flooded sections and keep her afloat, but the damage proved so severe she had to withdraw from the battle under destroyer escort. She spent the war's remainder under repair in Singapore, never returning to active service. Data, attacking from the opposite side of the Japanese column, targeted the heavy cruiser Maya, launching 4 torpedoes at 0956 hours. Multiple torpedoes hit. The explosions broke her keel and detonated her magazines. Maya split in half and sank in 8 minutes, taking 769 of her 1,000-man crew with her. In a single coordinated attack, lasting less than 30 minutes, 2 American submarines had sunk 2 fleet cruisers, crippled a third, and stripped the commander of the center force of his flagship, staff, command center, and effective communications at the opening of history's largest naval battle. Admiral Kurita transferred his flag to the battleship Yamato, but had lost his communications gear, his charts, his operations staff, and precious hours during the transfer. His subsequent performance at Leyte Gulf, marked by hesitation, confusion, and ultimately withdrawal, despite having American landing forces at his mercy, may have been partly caused by the submarine attack that disrupted his command structure at that critical moment. Whether Kurita would have pressed his attack more aggressively had his original staff and command facilities remained aboard. Otago remains unknowable, but the submarine strike certainly contributed to the uncertainty that led him to withdraw when success seemed within grasp. The broader consequence of Leyte Gulf was that the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased functioning as an effective fighting force. Japan lost 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The surviving ships, including the super battleship Yamato, became trapped in home waters by fuel shortages caused by submarines sinking tankers faster than Japan could replace them. Yamato possessed fuel for only a one-way voyage when she sortied in April 1945 for a suicide attack on American forces at Okinawa. She was sunk by carrier aircraft without reaching her target, going down with 2,498 of her 3,332-man crew. The remaining carriers, lacking fuel to train replacement pilots or conduct combat operations, sat idle while their aircraft were expended in kamikaze attacks. The decisive fleet battle for which Japanese naval doctrine had prepared over 40 years had been fought and lost, not through inferior tactics or insufficient courage, but because submarines had destroyed the logistics system keeping the fleet supplied. Japanese intelligence had underestimated this threat catastrophically. By early 1945, Japanese shipping losses had reached apocalyptic levels that made continuing the war economically impossible. American submarines, equipped with reliable torpedoes, possessing sophisticated intelligence about convoy routes from code-breaking operations, and commanded by aggressive officers who had learned their trade through combat, intercepted and destroyed merchant shipping at a rate Japan couldn't possibly sustain. In January 1945, American boats sank 252,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. February saw 182,000 tons go down. March brought 269,000 tons. April, another 186,000 tons. Every single month, submarines were sinking several times the equivalent of Japan's entire monthly shipbuilding capacity. Each ship that went down meant lost cargo, lost crews, lost shipbuilding resources, lost strategic mobility, and another step toward economic collapse. Japanese shipyards, working frantically to replace losses, could construct approximately 300,000 tons of merchant shipping per year at maximum capacity, assuming they had adequate steel, workers, and electrical power, all increasingly difficult to find. American submarines were sinking more than triple that tonnage every month. The mathematics were simple and pitiless. Japanese merchant capacity was declining inevitably towards zero, regardless of whatever naval and army forces might accomplish on battlefields. By August 1945, Japan possessed virtually no merchant marine left. Surviving ships hid in ports, not daring venture into waters controlled by American submarines that commanded the seas more completely than any naval force in history. The human toll of the submarine campaign remains difficult to calculate precisely, but was certainly devastating for Japanese merchant sailors. These civilians serving aboard merchant vessels died by the thousands as submarines torpedoed their ships, became trapped below decks as explosions opened holes, drowned in oil-filled waters, burned alive when tankers ignited, died of exposure in lifeboats that drifted for weeks without rescue. Japanese merchant sailors suffered terribly. The Imperial Japanese Navy maintained no effective rescue service for merchant sailors, dismissing them as expendable civilians rather than critical national resources deserving protection. Many American submarine commanders, operating under unrestricted warfare orders yet retaining human decency, surfaced after attacks to offer survivors water, food, and directions to nearest land. Japanese military personnel, indoctrinated to view Americans as barbaric racists, often refused assistance, swimming away from rescue or rejecting help from enemies they had been taught were subhuman. The story of Japanese dismissal of American torpedo improvements stands as a cautionary lesson in how intelligence failures compound into strategic disaster. Japanese naval intelligence officers confronted with accurate evidence of American torpedo failures in 1942 concluded that American weapons were fundamentally flawed and would remain so. This assessment shaped resource allocation decisions that prioritized decisive battle doctrine over convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare. When American engineers systematically identified and corrected every torpedo defect, Japanese intelligence agencies proved slow to recognize the transformation and even slower to convince operational commanders to adjust strategy and tactics. By the time Japanese naval planners grasped the true magnitude of the submarine threat, it was too late. The ships had already sunk, the merchant marine had been obliterated, the economy had been strangled beyond recovery. Victory in the Pacific War was determined not by the spectacular carrier battles at Midway and the Philippine Sea that captured public imagination and dominated headlines, but by the grinding attrition of submarine warfare that destroyed Japan's capacity to sustain combat operations. The weapon Japanese intelligence had mocked as evidence of American incompetence became the instrument of Japanese defeat, proving that in warfare, dismissing enemy capabilities based on early failures is a mistake nations make at their peril. The American submarine campaign represented industrial warfare at its most ruthless and effective, demonstrating that numerical superiority, logistical capacity, and engineering capability can overcome initial technical failures to produce victory through relentless pressure that enemies cannot match or counter. Japan's navy sank not in glorious battle, but in the cold mathematics of tonnage lost versus tonnage built, a calculation where American industrial might and Japanese intelligence failures combined to produce inevitable defeat. The submarines that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as incompetent with defective weapons became the force that strangled the Japanese empire, sinking more tonnage than all other American forces combined, destroying the maritime logistics system that an island nation required for survival, demonstrating that wars are won not just through tactical brilliance or operational excellence, but through the grinding economic realities of industrial capacity, resource availability, and the ability to learn from failures and implement solutions. Japanese intelligence failed to understand that American torpedo failures in 1942 were temporary technical problems that American engineering and industrial capacity would eventually solve, not permanent markers of fundamental inferiority. That failure of understanding and assessment cost Japan the war.